So welcome to the second part of our talk on GDP. And we left off with the measurement problems. What we're trying to do is very straightforward. We're simply trying to measure economic activity. But sometimes that can be complicated when you have a country producing a variety of different items. And some of those items, some of those activities are not reported to the government. Now, what are some of the ways we could actually read in between the lines to get an idea that maybe the official figures are not representative of the real level of activity? Well, images of the Earth might be used to refine GDP data. What do I mean by that? Well, take a look at this. Here's a picture of Eastern Europe. Now, on the left-hand side, we have a picture in 1992, and look at the distribution of lights. Now, this is right when the Berlin Wall fell, right after the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union disintegrated, and a lot of these countries, Slovakia, Hungary, parts of Poland, left the Soviet Union. And so this is the level, these lights basically represent activity. Now, what's interesting is when we go from 1992 to 2002, you could see the lights moved westward. So you have intensity in this area, but notice how the intensity moved to the left, which is eastward. And so this is a way to show where activity is moving. And there's no need to do any sort of measurements. You could see it by the intensity of the lights. Now here's the most extreme example. This is a picture of East Asia. Here we have Japan. Over here we have China. Now what looks to be an island is really not an island. This is the Korean Peninsula. And the Korean Peninsula, let me get my pen here. The Korean Peninsula is moving. It's right like this, right? And what you don't see is you don't see any lights in this area right here. This is North Korea. This big source of light, that's the capital of South Korea, Seoul. And this little teeny light right here, that's the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang. And you could see that there is very little activity as measured by light intensity in North Korea. And you don't need any official GDP data to tell you that. So now the production of most goods and services involves series of stages of production, right? You got to gather your resources, you got to maybe process them, put them together, assemble them, and then bring them to market. So there's different stages of production. Now to accurately measure GDP, we only want to count the value at the final stage. Now this means we can't count the value of goods used in the production process. We call those goods that are used in the production process intermediate goods. Because if we did that, we would be double counting. So the value added approach is the increase in the market value at each stage of the production process. Now, here's a good example of when we have 4 stages of production. In this case, we're producing bagels. The farmer grows the wheat. Then the miller converts the wheat into flour. Then the baker makes the bagel, and the bagel store sells it to the final consumer. Now, each stage increases the value of the product. Now, the final sale price of this bagel is 75 cents. But if we counted each stage in GDP, we would be double counting. For example, this 12 cents that the farmer contributed to the production of the bagel Well, that 12 cents is represented in each step of the production process. So if we uh, added each step as well as the sale of the bagel, 75 cents, we would be counting this 12 cents 4 times. So what we do is we don't add these values in GDP. We only count the final sale price because this final sale price includes all 4 only once. So this is why we use the value added approach, so we avoid double counting intermediate goods. Looking at the value of output, but trying to control for the effects prices have on that output. For example, let me just give you a little way of looking at things. Oh, I don't want to use that. Let me give you a pen instead of a highlighter. Now, if you take the price of a product and multiply it by how many units were produced, we call that output quantity. You get the value of that all output. So that's the value. Now, GDP is the value of all output. So GDP is really the price of the output multiplied by how many units were produced. But the problem is if I increase prices, but I hold output constant, you could see that GDP will go up. But if GDP uses output to measure activity and activity hasn't changed, you could see rising prices distorts what's really happening in the economy. It gives you the impression that activity has increased, but it really hasn't because output hasn't changed. So what we've got to do is we've got to find a way, if we're going to try to use output as a measurement of activity, we got to find a way of holding prices constant. Therefore, if we're holding prices constant and if GDP goes up, it must be because of changing output. And that is what we call real GDP. Real GDP tries to control for changing prices. Nominal GDP does not. So let me just get rid of all this stuff that I've just drawn. So, as I said, distinguishing increases in quantity from increases in prices is done by distinguishing between real and nominal GDP. Nominal GDP does not control for changing prices. So when nominal GDP goes up, it could be because of rising prices or rising output or both. Real GDP does try to control for changing prices. Therefore, if real GDP goes up, it must be attributable to a change in output and not a change in prices. So a nice little memory trick is a change in real GDP reflects a change in real activity. And this distinction between nominal and real GDP is important whenever we have changes in price levels, or in other words, inflation. So if you're going to compute real GDP and you want to control for changing prices, you've got to choose a period in which you want to start the measurement of those prices. We call that the base period. And this is the basis for indexing price changes. Now, what we see here is if we want to calculate real GDP, what we do is we take nominal GDP in a particular year and we divide that by the price index we create. And if the price index has gone up, the numerator goes up, which means real GDP will be less than nominal GDP. So for example, if nominal GDP is roughly $10.4 billion, and we have a price index of 101.5, meaning prices have gone up by 1.5%. What we do is we divide that $10.5 trillion, divide it by the price index, and notice how real GDP is going to be less than nominal GDP. That's because some of the increase in nominal GDP was attributable to price changes. If we filter that out, the increase is not as much. And here's an example. From 2001 to 2002, real nominal GDP increased from 10.1 trillion to 10.5 trillion. But if we filter out, and that's an increase of about 380 million. If we filter out the increase in prices, which were about 1.5%, the increase will not be as much. And what we see here, instead of going from 10.1 trillion to 10.5 trillion, we're only going to go from 10.1 trillion to 10.3 trillion. So in other words, real GDP is going to be less than nominal GDP. And the bottom line is inflation. Inflation is the average increase level of prices. So when you have inflation, that can make nominal GDP distort nominal GDP. Therefore, we have to filter out the effects of inflation. And when we do that, real GDP will not be as big as nominal GDP. So inflation, in other words, increases the average price level of goods and services, and it inflates nominal GDP. So if we're going to look at output as activity, we could break it down into different parts. And one way of breaking it down is by who uses the output. So there are four groups that participate in any economy. There are consumers, sometimes we'll call them households, and we talk about the goods and services produced for households. We call those consumption goods and services. Then we have businesses who participate in the economy. We call those goods and services produced for businesses investment goods and services. The government also participates in the economy, and we call those goods and services made for the government spending. And any country engaged in international trade has foreigners participating in their economy. So goods and services made for foreigners, we call those net exports. So this is a way of breaking down GDP by who gets the output. So again, consumption goods and services, these are goods and services made for households. And this is the largest component of GDP. So in other words, 2/3 of US GDP is for household consumption. Now, business goods and services for businesses, investment goods and services, not as large as consumption goods and services. This is only about 15% of the overall economy. But this tends to be the most volatile component of GDP. In other words, activity for businesses tends to fluctuate more than all of the other components of GDP. And this includes inventory, goods and services made for consumers but not purchased in a given year. So when a company makes something and they don't sell it in that particular year, we say the business purchased it in terms of inventory. So inventory is part of investment goods and services. Now, I don't want to, this is just an example of how you could value goods and services produced but not purchased in a given year. And you could take a look at it, but I don't want to really get into too detail. Now, there are goods and services made for the government. For example, salaries paid for police. Those are police services. That would be grouped under the government category of GDP. Then there's goods and services made for foreign sector. Now, the reason why we say the word net exports is because what we do is we don't want to count spending on output that was not produced in the United States. For example, if the clothing you wear, a good chance is that was not produced in the United States. Even though you purchased it in the United States, it was not produced in the United States. That's an import. If we're going to look at spending on all output, we have to back out spending on foreign goods and services. And this is why we call this net exports. What we do is we take imports and we subtract exports, and that difference is what we call net exports. And that's where I want to leave it to here, but I'm going to show you how, in the next video, how we actually go about computing GDP.